and welcome everyone to the post-lunch sessions at the day 2 of IPPN 2021. At this time, we are having 3 parallel sessions. There is one of the curated paper sessions in the presentation hall 1, which will be chaired by Aditya Dar, the Assistant Professor, Economics and Public Policy at the Indian School of Business. We will have another session in the presentation hall 2, chaired by Arjun Goswami, the Director Public Policy of Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. And here we have in the auditorium a very interesting panel discussion being moderated by Pranjal Jain, co-founder and design researcher, the UX Whale India. The panel is on anticipating unintended consequences in policy making through design. As the panelists for this panel, we have Devanuj Balkrishna, Associate Professor, JK Lakshmipat University, Jaipur. We have Padmini Murray, founder of Design Beku, Pavan Singh, Honorary Fellow, Australia India Institute, and Soumya Naidu, Design Researcher, Center for Internet and Society. Thank you, Pranjal, for bringing together this panel, and over to you for the panel discussions.
Thank you, Arushi. Thank you for having us in this conference and for this panel. Good afternoon to everyone. Hope we all had good lunch and we were able to take out time outside the screen. I'm honored to put together this panel. And before we kickstart this panel, would like to start introducing our panelists, but also would love to share the intention behind this panel. This panel might be a little bit provocative in the sense which you're going to hear from our panelists, how design and policy merge together, how they go together. There are many open-ended questions, and feel free to put any questions on the Q&A box. We would love to take them as we go along in our panel. To set the context, and all these things what we are going to discuss are debatable, and feel free to debate, critique what we are saying, and that's how we want the healthy discussion to happen. So traditionally, policy making has been defined as a very rational process, which involves a very linear path from problem definition to analyzing options and development of the policy solution. But in the recent times, which we are seeing, the definition of policy making has been contested due to messiness, which comes from the complex system we live in. It has been observed that even well-intended consequences or interventions in the policy have unintended consequences. The well-intended interventions in the policy often have unintended consequences. And from the last 1.5 days, we have been seeing that different policymakers, technocrats are talking about how they are thinking to design policy which serves the intended intervention. But here we are questioning that there could be unintended consequences, and hence this panel comes into the picture. Moving forward, when we are using the word messiness, we would love to understand from our panelists what does this messiness means. To moving forward, the obvious answer to the problem is that how the problems of the future is going to increase by this one word, messiness. Technology, socio-political, and democratic should play an important role by being messier in messiness. That contribution will be more in making problems complex, intermediate, intermittent, and interconnected rather than the other way around. So the question in front of our panelists is, can design as a field could offer assistance? If the design is a possible approach, then we need to ask, what is design? Whose design are we talking about? So now I would love to introduce our panelists. First would be Dr. Devanuj Balkrishna. Devanuj is a professor of design at JKLU, JK Lakshmipat University, Jaipur. He holds a PhD in interaction design from IDC School of Design, IIT Bombay. His research interests are primarily oriented toward design of contextually appropriate digital technologies for the emergent user, or the commonly word known use is next billion user. He's also an advisor at the UX Whale, a consortium of design researchers who desire to help companies, particularly startups, in defining strategies. He had earlier worked as a technology researcher at TCS Limited, where he had developed and coded algorithms. So how we are going to have this panel, we'll introduce the panel one by one, and in that duration, they could give their opening remarks, and then we will come back again. So every panelist will get around 5 to 10 minutes to share their thoughts on what we are going to discuss today. And then in between, if there are any Q&A, we could take our Q&A after Soumya's discussion. And we'll try to be more interactive. This Zoom do not allow us to be a two-way communication, but we will try our best. So please put your Q&A in the Q&A box. Sorry, put your questions in the Q&A box. Over to you, Devanish.
Thank you, Pranjal, and hi, everyone. So as we see that we are talking about unintended consequences in policymaking. Now, as designers, you know, this unintendedness is has always been a very crucial aspect in our practices. And you know, as a group, we had been thinking how do we bring the approaches and methods which we use in design to policy making, which is a really complex and I would say a fluid space. So let me come and start with the question itself: why, you know, policy making has unintended consequences, may have unintended consequences. As a general overview, because I'm not a policymaker, I'm basically a designer. However, what I have understood is that often, and that happens when we try to solve design problems also, that there are different stakeholders who may have diverse agenda. And often many of these agendas may be opposed to each other. At the same time, the stakeholders for whom we are designing, whether it is an artifact or a system or a policy, often these stakeholders have different kinds of and you know, relationships with each other. As I said, that these relationships could be antagonistic at some times. So of course, when it comes to the beneficiaries of policy, then these complex systems become more complex, and that is what is one source of unintendedness. The second is, as I have indicated, that the systems in which policies work are complex, and as we all know that systems complexities exist in many dimensions: socio-cultural, economic, technological, and most importantly, political. So I don't have to repeat all these things, but it is important to set up the base for the discussion. The third and more important, and I think is something which adds to the complexity, is that world is changing very fast. The demographical shifts are happening. The technological shifts have already been there, but they are moving at a very fast pace. The technological shifts, which used to take 50 years, now take 2-3 years. And so what do we do in this situation? People are aspirational. People are seeing things are changing. People themselves are changing. What do we do? Now, this is where we start, and we say that design can help. Now, for many of us, many of people around us would think design nice. It is making nice and beautiful things around us. We have seen so many great buildings. We have seen, you know, nice fashion designers on, you know, all around. India has been made proud by design. So let us say what we can do. We can, of course, yes, we can make nice artifacts for people today. People will feel happy. However, there is another term which is often hyphenated with design, design thinking. And as soon as I bring design thinking, the whole way of looking at design changes. Now it talks about the systemic level of systemic problem solving, a problem solving which which accepts complexity, or rather it celebrates the complexity. However, let me tell you that this hyphenated thinking is something which is not required. Design thinking, as it is understood, has always been the discourse of design. This is because design, when we talk about design, is about artifacts, thinking about artifacts, thinking around artifacts, and thinking with artifacts, right? Now, artifactuality is the core, is the, as I say, unit of analysis in design. However, one has to realize that artifacts do not exist without their users. The artifact and the users, the people who use artifact, that is what designers look at. And that is where the artifact does not exist in isolation, but it exists, in the form of interaction. So it is not just a this implement for carrying loads, but it is also where it is curved, why it is designed in a particular way, where it will be stopped. If I take this kind of artifact to my class in the university, what meanings it will contain, it will convey. And the most importantly, artifacts and the people have their contexts. They have their socio-cultural, politically, technology contexts, which are changing very fast and which are very complex. So I cannot isolate an artifact and say, no, I will design without understanding all these contexts and interactions. That is where the richness of design thinking comes. And therefore, when we talk about design in its context, so there was in the designer's approach, and which we'll see in the work of our panelists, is to unearth a lot of questions, lot of basic questions before we can even answer. So from a designer's approach, and you will see in our work, we unearth fundamental questions rather than hastening to answer them. And that is why our methods, they are very ethnographic, they are very contextual, they are very immersive, they are very fluid methods, which could be used in policy. The second thing is we use a lot of narrative and storytelling, because storytelling and narrative brings a lot of richness in the data. For example, I can simply ask, how do you have food when you travel outside? And somebody will say, yes, I go to some place. Now, when I convert into a story, then new nuances and new very finer points emerge, which surprise me, which I never thought could exist. I hate these business trips. I want food that isn't room service. What does it mean? Why that isn't a room service? So we are basically we look for provocations. Designers look for provocations, and that may help somewhere. The third thing is designers are trained to think by making. So making as a problem solving, making as a thinking. So rather than proving something in terms of concepts, in terms of theory, so that proving could be done by making and remaking, because once we make things, it becomes concrete, and then more questions emerge, and those questions could be then further addressed by remaking. That is why a lot of making and story, prototype making and sketching is happening. We use in design. So now with all these ways of doing things. Our question is, can we help identify unintended consequences by thinking through making, by storytelling, and by getting immersed into the context? Can we see unintended consequences which may happen 5 years down the line? The policy has been designed, implemented, and then this new thing starts happening. This surprise starts happening. Can we look that beforehand, much beforehand? In my opinion, yes, because a lot of these good places around the world, they are exactly doing that. Some of them are here, but there are many more. And of course, we can also do. And with that, I pass on the control to my other colleagues who will present their work. And let us see how does all this artifactuality and immersiveness and stories, how these techniques have been put into the practice to generate the right questions, to anticipate what could be happening, and with the ultimate aim to solve them, because design is basically interventionist. So our intention is to solve, and for this group over here is to see how it can be taken to a very large and complex space called policy. So over to you, Soumya.
Thank you. Thank you, Devanush. Can you leave the slide at this point?
Yes.
So thank you, Devanush, for setting up the context. World is complex and it is changing at a rate which is making it more complex. So we have covered what is design in your presentation. We have understood how design is used. So, and in the storytelling is one of the methods which designers use to tell the story, to tell what are the problems and build more provocations. So at this point, I would like to bring Soumya Naidu to share her specific case study which she is working on. To introduce Soumya, Soumya is a design researcher at the Center for Internet and Society. She works on critically examining the role of design in digital technologies, especially in areas such as digital identities, privacy, and AI. She is a communication designer who graduated from National Institute of Fashion Technology, Delhi, and has a master's degree in social design from Ambedkar University. Over to you, Soumya.
Thank you, Pranjal, and thank you so much, Devanuj, also for setting the stage actually for the conversation. I would like to begin by kind of just introducing a little bit more of the work that I do. I'm working with this organization called Center for Internet and Society, and we look at tech policy and related to specifically privacy, cybersecurity, AI, etc. And we try to look at commenting on the regulations and policies that come up, and then we try to analyze or comment on them. Essentially, very, very simplistically that. But the work that I have been involved in at CIS has been around how to also critique all of these policies through the lens of design. When we say lens of design, I also mean in terms of not just visual design, but also strategically looking at how design can be thought of in kind of processing these policies and understanding the consequences of bills and regulations. So some of the work, for example, has been around how privacy notices are designed and what implication does that have when people use these applications, platforms, etc., and how can we critique that as well. So very simply, visually that, and then of course at a larger scale, looking at regulations such as the data protection bill, etc., and then critiquing that as well. The project, although that I want to talk about now, is mostly to do with creating an identity system for a country. And we've been working on this project for the last year and a half. I think to begin with, I want to also take forward what Devanuj mentioned earlier in his presentation. He described three key characteristics of design, which I would also want to highlight. One is, of course, that design is about questioning a lot. It is about asking questions. Secondly, it has to do a lot with anticipation. It has to do a lot with understanding how something would shape up in terms of artifacts, etc. Thirdly, we also talk about the reiterative process of design. So doing something and doing something over again and again and again to kind of reflect and kind of go back to it. So I think that these three characteristics are what make design useful for policymaking and useful for other kind of purposes as well, apart from its other visual characteristics. So I think, and these are the things that we've tried to use in this project as well. So the project essentially is about how to create a digital ID system for a country, and we have tried to do this by kind of doing a couple of studies with 4 different countries. So we looked at India, we looked at UK, we looked at Nigeria and Estonia, and we wanted to see how the ID systems in these countries have been and what can we learn from them to understand how to develop a framework and create ID systems for a country. What are the policy choices? What are the design choices? What are the technological choices that we should keep in mind while creating an ID system? For this purpose, the essential design approach that we wanted to take was to kind of conceptually include design in the process and try to think of how design can actually be of purpose in this project. To that end, we started looking at an approach which is systems thinking. I'm sure a lot of us are already familiar with systems thinking, but just to quickly kind of go over it, it's basically to see that a system consists of several components and the interconnectedness between them, and the patterns of behavior that it that comes out of this system and its components. So using this approach, we tried to kind of look at the ID systems in the different countries. And with thorough research for all these countries, we tried to kind of capture different processes that happen in, say, identification, authentication of an ID system. In this case, I'm trying to show you the India ID system, which is Aadhaar, of course, just so that we all have something familiar to kind of look at. Yeah, so I'm not going to really get into a lot of detail for how we've kind of created these maps, but just to give a fair sense of the fact that we've tried to capture all of this in various kind of visualizations, but to also clarify that I'm not trying to also project that the visualizations are the only way of kind of using design in this particular case. This is not for presentation. This is for capturing information, understanding research, deriving insights from that research as well. So while these are some ways of capturing processes, we also try to capture a systems mapping of different sectors in a country. For instance, in India, we looked at the healthcare sector, and we tried to develop this mapping of different entities within a healthcare sector, and then how the ID system is used in between these entities. How does data travel between these entities? What is the nature of interconnectedness between these entities? What kind of patterns they form? So similarly, we've done this for other, so several other ID systems that are also emerging in the country. For instance, there is, of course, the National Health Stack, which is a projected policy. It's not yet implemented, but we've tried to see how that system would be if it came about, and how Aadhaar would play a role in it, or any other new ID system would play a role in it. Similarly, we're looking at India Stack and other cases. So I think what I would like to highlight about the project is not just the way we've done it, but also our learnings and reflections on the project. So while we tried to use systems thinking to understand how these countries have developed a system of ID system, but we've also tried to understand then what do we learn from this? What is the insight that we derive out of these systems mappings? So we did struggle a lot in trying to draw inferences from these mapping also, because this is the first time we're all trying to explore systems mapping in such a project. So how does that play out? What kind of questions we should be asking? So the basic questions that we started with were around privacy, were around inclusivity, were around access. In this particular system, if Aadhaar is being used by certain kind of agencies and government institutions, What does that mean for the citizen? What does that mean for a resident? Does it include everybody? Who does it exclude? If it's excluding people, what is the redressal mechanism to make sure that they get access to these systems? What are the ways in which privacy is being compromised or being enhanced? So these were the questions that we primarily started with. But we also realized that we need to kind of move on to several other questions of, say, gender, caste, and class, which we haven't really dealt with yet. So I think those are the kind of primary reflections that we had. Other than that, we also tried to look at how this has been a mostly from the research from the perspective of policymakers, from the perspective of research that is already there. But we want to also take it to the step of speaking to people at a more primary level, conducting more primary research in order to understand how say an experience or a perspective of a resident is when they're in this system. How do they experience an ID system? When do they when do they have these processes of authentication, of verification? What is their experience of exclusion? What is their experience of maybe inconvenience in many cases? So I think that is definitely a step and an approach which is also close to design a lot, because design essentially depends on speaking to people. We have tools like co-design, we have tools like participatory design. How do those get included in such a case? And not just by making it jargon heavy in any sense, but also actually coming up with insights that are useful for developing an ID system. So I think that's mostly it from me. I could go on, but I'd rather stop, I think. And of course, I would be happy to add later.
Thank you, Soumya, for sharing design is more than aesthetic. And thank you for bringing the system thinking part into design for our audience. So if there are any questions from our audience, we could take at this point. I have one question to ask from you, Soumya, but we could come back later once Pavan speak. But just to share it with our audience and with you, that would love to understand that how can system thinking inform policymaking process, or is system thinking already part of policymaking, which is good to ponder, and we will come back later. Other thing which you have highlighted is about basic questions need to be addressed, or we should always start with the basic questions, and questions lead to more questions, and that is more important in part of acknowledging it. And that's how the complexity and messiness, whatever we call it, will come into the picture. But it would be good to have those and embrace those questions and more questions. So at this point, we have one question from our audience.
So can I answer that?
Yeah, let me just read that question and then you could answer. How can we understand the level of the accuracy for the effect of design thinking in policymaking?
Okay, so as I said, that design gives equal importance, or sometimes I said equal importance to asking questions. And if you're unearthing more and more questions, see the questions which tend to be disregarded, then the question of accuracy does not appear in terms of when you're asking question. So design is very much interested in have I generated.
Thank you, Devanaj. Would also like to bring in Padmini and would love to introduce her, and then if she is also willing, she could answer the question.
Sure.
So Dr. Padmani Ray Murray is the first.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
So we'll answer this later.
Right. Sorry to interrupt. So Dr. Padmani Ray Murray is the founder of Design DAY-2, a feminist collective that endeavors to place an ethics of care at the heart of digital and design practice. Padmani established the first degree level digital humanities program in India at Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, where she was the post-director from 2016 to 2018. Currently, she is co-investigator on gendering in the smart city with Professor Ayuna Datta and the digital lead on 2 centuries of Indian print, a project in collaboration with the British Library and Jadavpur University. Over to you, Padmini. We would love to understand from you how do you critique the current design practices, how policy should think about, and if you have any answer to the question which our audience is asking, feel free to answer.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for inviting me, Pranjal, to be part of this. And yes, thank you, Devanuj, for setting the stage and also beginning to answer that question. I think hopefully, like through my talk, we might kind of actually explore the answer to that question, which is as to the, I guess, to the legitimacy of design thinking. So as my title suggests, we don't really kind of think of design thinking as a suitable paradigm for thinking through policy. I think one of the core reasons for this is that design thinking, as a way that it has been kind of predicated and implemented, is based on this assumption that there is a solution, one solution. And when we're talking about participatory processes such as policymaking, and I think I will underline the fact that policymaking must always be, in a democracy, a participatory process, one solution cannot fit all. And we have seen this through our research, which I will be discussing in a little bit, and which is why I think, in answer to the question that was asked, I think there is no question of accuracy. This is not a quantitative exercise with one singular answer. This is policymaking is or should be a consistently interrogative exercise, which is kind of leading us to different kind of possibilities rather than solutions. So I just want to talk a little bit about Day-2, which is a collective that I founded in 2018, just to kind of explain kind of why I felt the need for it to exist. And I think, as Devanuj said in his introduction, we are in an increasingly, quote unquote, messy world with advances in technology, with, kind of increase in accessibility to technology in this country and elsewhere. And this obviously means that the impact of, say, harm caused by technology is becoming a kind of essential concern for those of us who are interested in individuals not being affected by things like corporate surveillance, by things like big tech, and its ownership increasingly of all of our digital ecosystems. So the way that we kind of think through design and the digital is by seeing how and where we can place what we call an ethics of care. This phrasing is not our own. It is taken from a number of prominent feminist critics, and I've just kind of included a definition here, which is, it is a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. And I think, a crucial thing to therefore remember is that an ethics of care is often about maintenance and not kind of breaking and starting anew, which means that it is a generative process, it is an exponential process. And therefore, as I said earlier, it isn't a question of, positing one question, then seeking a solution, and then kind of demolishing it in favor of a new solution. We kind of believe in a much more kind of in a networked and kind of exponential, almost rhizomatic kind of response to, the creation of policy. I think something else that I think is really important to remember is that design thinking comes out of a fundamentally corporate space. It is something that was pioneered by IDEO, who felt the need to come up with design thinking as a way to make themselves relevant as a consultancy in time when the US was losing its its grasp on the center stage. And I think it is very important to remember that a paradigm that is intended for corporate conditions is not something that can be easily transposed, nor should it be transposed into the space of governance and participatory governance. So the first example that I want to talk about is based on the outcomes of a workshop, which was facilitated by us in collaboration with Smriti Parshira at NIPFP. This was held just on the eve of the lockdown last year, which is why we had limited participation. We had 13 people with disabilities who had participated, and it was to understand their experiences with Aadhaar. So I'm just going to quickly go through, our learnings and findings from that exercise. I think one of the major kind of things that we found is that the mandatory nature of Aadhaar meant that since people with disabilities who are very dependent on such kind of security, privacy instruments, were kind of humiliated by the process that required them to actually get Aadhaar. It was an incredibly fraught process, that of onboarding. There were several kind of obstacles that were placed in the way by way of its kind of very rigid onboarding system, which included things like biometric identification. And this obviously kind of felt very stigmatizing to people with disabilities who found this experience required them to be dependent on other people. And I think many of, all of the individuals in our workshop were very keen to point to the fact that they are independent individuals who have made their way in the world successfully, and therefore having to be so dependent on other people in order to be onboarded onto something that should be easily an easy thing to do was fundamentally kind of detrimental to their self-worth. I think relatedly, it's a rigid top-down system architecture, which does not really take into account disabilities. If you even now, if you go to the website for Aadhaar and onboarding Aadhaar, the options given for people with disabilities are either not there or very difficult to find, and therefore it excludes the very people that it's supposed to benefit. Again, relatedly, obviously, when there have been problems with being onboarded onto the system and therefore being denied months, even years of welfare, the grievance redressal system, so if one complains due to the fact that for some reason or the other, they are not being able to be onboarded onto Aadhaar, these systems of grievance redressal themselves are incredibly broken, which means that people with physical, social, financial, and emotional, it expends a lot of emotional labor to have to then, kind of constantly jump through these hoops in order to ensure redressal occurs. I think Aadhaar itself as an instrument, what it means to a person with disabilities, I think is also somewhat opaque. We do know that now there is a new disability card, but I will kind of discuss the difficulties with that as a consequence, which is that there are obviously, with the onboarding of Aadhaar, there are kind of street level bureaucrats, what we call street level bureaucrats, people who facilitate the onboarding, but obviously they are only, they only have enough kind of power within the kind of very tight parameters of what the social technical system allows them to do. And so therefore, even if they wish to help someone with disabilities to kind of get around these, difficulties, their hands are tied, and it's very unfortunate that they cannot be more helpful in this process. I think something that we, fundamental learning was that, most of the people in that room, they think of themselves as educated, privileged, they are fairly independent, and therefore they do not really feel that the stigmatizing nature of being kind of classified as a person with disability first is something that they are willing to accept. And I think if participatory processes in policymaking were more transparent, that is something that policymakers would learn, that a person with a disability does not fundamentally necessarily want to be identified with their disability. So this, and therefore this brings me to the new Savalamban card, which is a new card for disability, people with disabilities. And again, that what it does is it puts front and center their disability rather than, seeing themselves, than seeing them with, as independent people who depend or who decide, the kind of the role that the quantity that role plays in their self-identification. So as it says here, claiming one's identity and voluntary and contextual disclosure of disability. They do not always want to be recognized as disabled. They want to be able to have the power and the control to assert when they wish to say that I am a person with disabilities or to not disclose. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip the next slide and move on to our second case study, which was around the Personal Data Protection Bill. So as most of you know, the Personal Data Protection Bill was seen as a watershed moment for privacy bills in India because it claimed to emulate certain kind of principles that are kind of now internationally accepted as standards for privacy, such as those set up by the GDPR. And as you can see from the slide here, there is a privacy by design policy kind of set out in the bill. But I think one thing that we really want to wish to argue at Design People is that a lot of the kind of conditions in the bill itself are completely at the mercy of, if you like, interface design. So there has to be a far deeper kind of importance and a far deeper attention paid to the interface in the deliverance of governance, right? So as this quotation says, the interface is described as the first object of mediation between the law, rights, and individuals. And so therefore the interface, which is where people encounter governance, especially in an increasingly digitally kind of dominated governance system, we must think more deeply about the interface, speak to users of the interface. And when we say users here, we're now talking about the next billion users, their preferences, what they understand when they look at an interface, to ensure that they are making informed choices around content and privacy, rather than choices that are being imposed upon them from above. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Padmini, for highlighting the issues with the disability with Aadhaar and also bringing the pragmatic way to look at the digital interfaces and how we should raise more questions. Would like to invite Pavan Singh at this point. Dr. Pavan Singh has a PhD in communication from the University of California, San Diego. From 2016 to 2019, he was a new generation network scholar at Deakin University and the Australia-India Institute. His work examines the contestations around data privacy in India from a legal, cultural, and technological perspective. Over to you, Pavan. Would love to understand your views around the whole case of design and policy and what Devanoj, Soumya, and Padmini are bringing in.
Thank you, Pranjal. First of all, I don't have a well-organized presentation. I'm just going to speak off the cuff, so if that's okay. I'll keep my comments and what I describe as my current and research I hope to foray into brief. I would begin by saying that having been trained in communication, for me, the question of design as a way of thinking or as a sensibility is a matter of communication, communicating how well we communicate certain. So I would like to think of design as a communication practice. For example, when we look at privacy policies as an artifact which has been designed by certain stakeholders. So it's communicating certain things to the so-called unmarked user. And the word user is often used in the most generic sense. And I think that we need to think more about how, we can map the expectations of the user in relation to the design of something, an artifact such as a privacy policy. So that's the first thing I'd say, that I would like to think of design as a communication practice, and specifically when it comes to privacy and things like privacy policies or disclosures or any kind of, something as simple as when GDPR was implemented, we all got notifications saying that we use cookies or, disclosures about GDPR compliance by various digital platforms and apps. So I would like to also build upon what Padmini was saying about disability and sort of broaden it to concerns of identity in general in context. So I would like to think that design should have, not being a scholar of design, but of critical theory and communication, I would like to think that design should have a continued relevance to the context of a person's lived identity. So as technology is changing fast, very, at a speed with which policy making is not able to keep up. So we need to have a design principle or design sensibility that has continued relevance to a person's life. And I could say user, but it's kind of clunky to say user because the design assumes this transactional relation. It would assume this transactional relationship between a technological system and the human using that system. And that brings me to the third point, which is the research which I've been meaning to do, and I've done a bit of it. I've published that research on the affective dimensions of design and the mediation of human experience by technology. So when I say mediation of human experience by technology, there's the sense of design is kind of implicit within that. And I published a paper which is called Aadhaar and Anxieties of Recognition. And on the same lines as Padmini talked about, I looked at video testimonials of Aadhaar beneficiaries from various parts of India, mostly rural and semi-urban India, people trying to access the benefits, people trying to access their entitlements through the Aadhaar-enabled authentication system, which is called ABBA. I forget the acronym. But in that, I found that the way Aadhaar was implemented and designed for, what we call historically marginalized and invisible populations, obviously we know all the critiques of technocratic sensibility and top-down and, the thing with mandatory compliance that Aadhaar imposes on all these beneficiaries. Again, excludes them, and this is the principle that was talked about briefly. That was talked about previously. The principle of inclusivity, how a system excludes certain populations. So, and these are not just disabled populations and or differently abled populations, but people with in certain occupations, and this is something. Which Soumya's presentation, I think, talked about also, people who have, their fingerprints fade or old age doesn't allow them to be, compliant with Aadhaar. So I would think that privacy as instead of this thing that we are preserving or that we are mediating and, trying to preserve the integrity of in any kind of interaction with technology. I would like to think of privacy as a set of anxieties which are brought on by technology, brought on by our experience using technology. And this is very evident in the experience of Aadhaar beneficiaries who would have to repeatedly scan their finger on the scanner, but it wouldn't either. The operator would say it's not working deliberately or falsifying deliberately, or it would not really work. So one transaction that happens that shapes your experience, Aadhaar authentication failure, and if it happens repeatedly, then it generates an anxiety about your own. It turns the lens back on you, your identity, the integrity of your data, which you'd submitted to enroll in Aadhaar. And sort of it becomes an existential question then. So for me, if I'm to talk about design, I think it should also be a mitigating, it should also incorporate mitigation of these anxieties about our identities, about who we are. And so I think that's where I'd like to think about this idea that design thinking is important to the experience of people in everyday life. So my approach would be more affective, looking at not just one specific experience of identifying, interacting with technology, but as a lived anxiety over a period of time. And this would not just include differently abled people or experiences of disability, but other kinds of anxiety as we navigate technological systems in our everyday life. So to just wrap up quickly and summarize, I think the first thing for me is design as a communication practice, which again, what kind of communication that is. As things stand in terms of policymaking, it's top down, it's one-way communication, privacy policies. We don't, unless we are armed with legal expertise, we can't really intervene as everyday human beings using technological systems. So that's one. Second is thinking about technological systems as affective, as generating certain kinds of affective experiences. And as I said, anxiety is one such experience. Anxiety about who one is in relation to the technology that often fails us in terms of recognition. Third, and that sort of precludes then the inclusivity principle, the idea that design and technological systems should be inclusive at all times. And the third is the mitigation of such anxieties. So, sorry, my comments are rather, to borrow the term that was used in the beginning, messy. But that's where I think my research is at the moment, and I hope to collaborate with and have an interdisciplinary collaboration with other scholars in the field of design, technology, and digital identities. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavan. Thank you for bringing the very important point that the problem of using the word with the users. But we will come back to this point later if there are any points. But at any cost, in practical sense, we will end up using some sense of a word which we always say to our users, to humans for whom the policies are designed. And we need to be sensitive towards how we use, and Padmini's reference to the feminist critique and ethics of care could be used to understand how we articulate our audience. So moving on, I just want to highlight one more thing. As you mentioned, that privacy could be looked as set of anxieties. So now my question next could be is how the technical system should respond to this anxiety. One upfront answer which could come is from Soumya's work. Can system thinking come in play and try to look at how to address the anxieties in the socio-technical systems such as Aadhaar? We have one question in our chat which our audience is asking. If there are any more questions which people would love to ask from a panelist, feel free to put in the Q&A box. So open to Padmini, Soumya to answer the question.
Right. Padmini, would you like to go first? I think there is a question already that you would.
Thanks. So regarding the unintended consequences for the implementation of Aadhaar, the question is how could design thinking anticipate such a consequence, taking the example. So I think for us, personally speaking, we reject design thinking with a capital D, capital T, because as I said, design thinking with a capital D and T is meant and has emerged from a corporate paradigm, and therefore should not be kind of used to think about systems and service design, for that matter, for participatory democracy. So I'm just putting in the chat one of the organizations or rather collectives, networks that we find very inspiring, and definitely they are an inspiration for us in the way that we think about our work. And I think, the principal question is that they say, like in the second principle, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. So I would say that in our philosophy, our kind of very basic rule of engagement is to speak to the community concerned and ask them what they want, and then to work backwards from there, rather than the current, and I guess this is the current form all policy takes, which is ultimately what the government wants. And so, which is a kind of an assumption that what the government wants or what the state wants is the same as what people want. And that often, in a country like India, it's various, right? Some of that might align to what the state wants, some of that might not. And some of that might, as, I think the whole kind of premise of this conversation might be kind of things that are unintended, that are not understood necessarily unless you speak to the communities concerned. So I think ultimately kind of what this means is that we kind of move away from this kind of one size fits all and kind of think about, kind of more participatory rather than empathetic. I think, another kind of issue with design thinking is that it places this kind of notion of empathy at its heart. And I fundamentally think that saying that one can empathize with others can sometimes, kind of border on insult. Like, I do not think that it is possible for me to understand what it is like to be somebody from a marginalized caste and have disabilities and be a woman. I think, to say that I can empathize is disingenuous. So I feel, and, as Pavan was also saying in his methodology, kind of learning from people what their experiences are and then designing in response to that. So kind of, I guess, flipping the current mode is the way that at least, we try to kind of address it by designing.
So I would like to add here. So I'm a disabled person, and what Padmini showed in her first presentation is something which, comes to me on my face. So these are subtle issues because Padmini did a design oriented research, these questions bubbled up. Who is going to ask me whether, how do you feel about your identity on the identity card? So if you don't ask this question, where you are going to find it, whether it is accurate or not? The question has not been asked, not discussed. And you are talking about accuracy. Do I have the access? No, I don't want the access. My question is something else. Are we looking at those questions? So accuracy for questions which everybody is asking. What is the point there? Yeah.
Thanks. Also, if I may add just very quickly, I think the way we've also tried to look at systems thinking is to not really use it in the sense that it's used in design usually, also in the corporate kind of ways that it has been used. We've tried to come up with our own interpretation of the tool, of the methodology, based on the fact that we were not all designers working on this project. We were a bunch of designers, also lawyers, also people who are from varying backgrounds. And we realized that using a tool and picking it and putting it in this was not going to work. And, we had to find our ways of interpreting it in our own way, trying to see where it will fit, where it will not fit, and trying to use different methodologies in that sense as well. Another important thing that we also figured was that while design has been a lot around, I think the conversation has been a lot around human-centered design. We wanted to also kind of, as Padmini has pointed out with the design justice kind of resource, there's also a lot of conversation on our rights-centeredness of design. So how do you think about people's rights while you're designing this? And of course, not take decisions yourself, but have people who want to take their decisions by themselves. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Padmini, Devanuj, and Soumya, to bring out the point that instead of talking about the accuracy, we need to first ask the question. And then while we ask the question in the process, we will understand what our user or for whom we are designing the policy we will come to know, and what are the other things. And to move forward, a good policy can be crafted when, as Soumya mentioned in her project, that when different set of people with different background, with different learnings come together, policymakers, social scientists, technocrats, designers come together and brainstorm on one project. And There is a back and forth happening between the project, and then when they, even before just starting the project, go and ask the question from whom they're designing is the way forward if you have to think and reduce the messiness which we are talking about, which we started with in our presentation. If there are any more questions, we could take up those, or we could have our concluding remarks from Pavan, Devanuj, Padmini, and Soumya.
So I can start. So as Padmini said, that design thinking is a very packaged, is packaged from a particular audience, or in a very diluted way, if I use that strong opinion. So I would, request my audience to see the thoughts and writings of the thinkers who were designers during the 1960s and 50s, 60s, 70s, and before that. And they were the people who were talking about multidisciplinarity. They were the people who were talking about for whom artifacts are being designed, for whom technologies are being designed. So essentially, they were looking at consensus, they were looking at democracy, they were looking at justice. So it is like what we are talking here is nothing new. We are simply re-establishing what our those predecessors have said. Somehow design thinking has packaged into a very linear and very, very jacketed process, and something which can be done using post-its sitting in the room, which is something which should be challenged, I would say. So essentially what Soumya does is design, what Padmini does is design, what I do is design. It's not really, we don't want to call it design thinking. And design is much more richer than design thinking. Please come to any design school and look at the students' projects. You will know how vast and how comprehensive it can go. So I would invite people to come to my university and see students' projects.
So thank you, Devanuj, and thank you to our panelists. It's already 3 o'clock. So to wrap up, design is generative, iterative process. It highlights the policy. It highlights that the policies are top down, and how we could make it bottom up is what we need to think about. And we all are available. You could check out our bios. You could reach out to our email IDs. We are all available to help, and we are all eagerly waiting to make policy better. And we are here for the pragmatic way to move forward in designing policy making. Thank you all. Thank you for listening to us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pranjal, once again for moderating this very interesting panel. Thanks, Pavan, Soumya, Padmini, and Devanuj for all your insights. It was a very, very interesting aspect that you brought to this forum, and I'm sure the audience have benefited from it. We did get a lot of questions, and it was a wonderful engagement from the audience itself. Thank you once again.
Thank you.